A millionaire businessman invites his ex-girlfriend to his wedding with an heiress, but when she arrives with 2 children identical to him, everything changes. What happens next will surprise you. Before we begin this exciting story of love and redemption, comment below if you believe in second chances. Now let's dive into this incredible journey that begins in a cathedral in the heart of Mexico City. The scorching sun of Mexico City reflected off the towering skyscrapers, creating a spectacle of lights that rivaled the sparkle in Eduardo Ramírez's eyes. At 35, he was the picture of success. Owner of one of the country's largest tech companies, engaged to Valentina Ortega, heiress to a media empire, and about to have the wedding of the year. As he adjusted his silk tie in front of the mirror in his penthouse office, Eduardo couldn't contain a smile of satisfaction. Everything was perfect, or almost everything. His fingers hesitated over the golden envelope on his desk, a wedding invitation addressed to Clara Mendoza. Clara. The name still caused a twinge in his chest. She had been his first true love years ago, before his meteoric rise to success. Eduardo had convinced himself that inviting her to the wedding was a gesture of maturity, a way to show he had moved on from the past. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It was a need to prove something, to her and to himself. On the other side of the city, in a modest apartment in the Coyoacán neighborhood, Clara Mendoza held the same golden invitation, her hands trembling slightly. At 32, she was a different woman from the one Eduardo had known. Her eyes, once full of naive dreams, now carried a mixture of deep love and well-guarded secrets. "Mama, let's play." The cheerful voices of 2 children echoed through the apartment. Clara smiled, quickly tucking away the invitation. Her children, Mateo and Sofia, 5-year-old twins, were her life now. Children that Eduardo didn't know existed. As she played with the kids, Clara couldn't help but think about the decision she was about to make. Going to the wedding meant much more than reuniting with an ex-love. It meant confronting the past, revealing long-hidden truths, and perhaps changing the future of everyone involved. Fate was about to intertwine these lives again, in a dance of love, secrets, and redemption under the passionate sky of Mexico. The Metropolitan Cathedral of Mexico City was stunning, decorated with white and gold flowers that perfumed the air. The guests, the cream of Mexican society, filled the carved wooden pews, their murmurs of anticipation echoing through the centuries-old vaults. Eduardo stood at the altar, impeccable in his tailored tuxedo. His best friend and best man, Javier, whispered, "Nervous, buddy?" Eduardo forced a smile. "Of course not. It's the happiest day of my life." But his eyes kept wandering to the church entrance. He didn't know if he was more anxious to see his bride or Clara. Outside, Clara took a deep breath, adjusting the turquoise blue dress she had carefully chosen. Her children, Mateo and Sofia, looked adorable in their party clothes. "Remember what we talked about," she said softly, kneeling to be at eye level with the children. "Today is a very special and important day. You're going to meet someone very special." "The man in the photo?" Sofia asked innocently. Clara nodded, feeling a lump in her throat. "Yes, dear, the man in the photo." Inside the church, the music began to play, announcing the bride's entrance. Valentina was a vision in her French lace dress, her veil floating behind her like an ethereal cloud. Eduardo smiled when he saw her, but he couldn't help his eyes from continuing to scan the crowd. That's when he saw her. Clara entered quietly, guiding 2 small children by the hands. Time seemed to freeze. Eduardo felt the air leave his lungs. The children, they were identical to him as a child. Valentina reached the altar, radiant, but immediately realized something was wrong. Eduardo's gaze was fixed on a distant point, his face as pale as if he'd seen a ghost. "Eduardo?" she whispered, concerned. He blinked, coming back to himself, but his world had been turned upside down. "Sorry," he mumbled, trying to focus on the ceremony. The priest began to speak, his words about love and commitment sounding distant to Eduardo. His mind was in turmoil. Those children, it couldn't be a coincidence. The timing, the resemblance. He did a quick mental calculation. and felt his heart race. Clara, seated at the back of the church with the children, struggled to contain her emotions. She hadn't planned to cause a scene, but Eduardo's reaction upon seeing them was unmistakable. He knew, or at least he suspected. The ceremony proceeded, but the tension was palpable. Valentina, perceptive as she was, realized something was deeply wrong. Eduardo's vows sounded mechanical, his voice trembling slightly. When the moment came for if anyone objects to this union, the silence in the church was deafening. Clara felt all eyes turn to her, as if they somehow knew. She lowered her head, holding the children's hands tighter. Eduardo hesitated for a moment so long that the priest had to clear his throat to get his attention. "Mr. Ramírez? Eduardo stammered, his gaze alternating between Valentina and the back of the church where Clara was seated. Valentina, realizing something was terribly wrong, made a drastic decision. "We need a moment," she announced, her firm voice echoing. Through the cathedral. Taking Eduardo by the arm, she guided him to a side room, leaving the guests in a buzz of speculation. In the room, Valentina confronted Eduardo. "What's going on?" she demanded, her eyes shining with a mixture of anger and fear. Eduardo, feeling the weight of years of secrets and regrets, finally broke down. "That woman, Clara, she brought children who look exactly like me." Valentina's face paled. "Are you telling me you have children you didn't know about?" I think so," Eduardo admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. Outside, Clara was fighting her own internal battle. She didn't want to ruin anyone's day, but she also knew she couldn't hide the truth any longer. It was then that Javier, the best man, approached her. "Miss," he said softly, "I think it's best if you come with me." Clara nodded, her heart racing. Taking Mateo and Sofia by the hands, she followed Javier towards the room where Eduardo and Valentina were, knowing that the moment of truth had finally arrived. The tension was palpable in the small side room of the cathedral. Eduardo and Valentina were staring at each other in silence when the door opened, revealing Clara and the children, guided by Javier. Time seemed to freeze. Eduardo felt his heart stop for a moment as he saw Clara up close for the first time in years and the children. It was like looking into a mirror of the past. Valentina was the first to break the silence. "So it's true," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They are Eduardo's children." Clara nodded slowly. "Yes, they are. Mateo and Sofia." The children, sensing the tension in the air, clung to Clara's legs. Eduardo couldn't take his eyes off them. "Why?" was all he could say, his voice laden with emotion. "Why did you never tell me?" Clara took a deep breath, years of repressed emotions threatening to overflow. "I found out I was pregnant a few weeks after we broke up. You were so focused on your career, on building your empire. I didn't want to be an obstacle." Eduardo staggered as if he'd been punched. "An obstacle? Clara, they're my children." Valentina watched the scene with a mixture of shock and growing understanding. She had always known there was something in Eduardo's past that haunted him, something that prevented him from fully committing. Now she knew what. "Why now?" Valentina asked, surprising everyone with her calmness. "Why bring this up on our wedding day?" Clara looked directly into Valentina's eyes. "I didn't plan this. When I received the invitation, I thought it would be a chance to finally tell the truth, but when I got here..." She hesitated. "I realized I couldn't just let Eduardo get married without knowing." Eduardo approached the children, kneeling to be at their height. Mateo and Sofia looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Hello," he said softly. I'm your father." Sofia, brave like her mother, stepped forward. "We know. Mama showed us pictures of you." Eduardo looked at Clara, surprised and touched. She hadn't kept them completely in the dark about him. Valentina watched the scene, feeling her world crumble. She loved Eduardo, but seeing him with his children, the instant connection that formed, she knew things would never be the same. "Eduardo," she called softly. When he turned, she saw in his eyes something she had never seen before, a deep and unconditional love that wasn't directed at her. "I think we need to postpone the wedding." The room fell silent. Eduardo stood up, torn between the shock of the revelation and the realization that his life was about to change drastically. "Val, he began, but she interrupted him. "Don't say anything now, you have a lot to process, to figure out." She took off her engagement ring, gently placing it in his hand. "When you know what you really want, if it's still me, I'll be here." With dignity, Valentina left the room, leaving Eduardo, Clara, and the children in a silence heavy with possibilities and uncertainties. Javier, who had remained discreetly in the corner, approached Eduardo. "What do you want me to tell the guests?" Eduardo ran his hand over his face, the reality of the situation finally hitting him. Tell them the wedding is postponed, for personal reasons." When Javier left, Eduardo turned to Clara and the children. Years of unanswered questions, what-ifs and regrets seemed to weigh in the air between them. "We have a lot to talk about," Eduardo finally said. Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. "Yes, we do." Mateo, sensing the emotion in the air, pulled on Eduardo's sleeve. "Are you going away again?" The innocent question hit Eduardo like an arrow. He knelt again, looking into the eyes of his newly discovered children. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not going anywhere, I promise." As the murmurs of confused guests echoed through the cathedral, inside that small room a new family was beginning to form, built on revealed secrets and promises of a future together. In the weeks following the cancelled wedding, Eduardo found himself on an emotional roller coaster, torn between getting to know his children and dealing with the consequences of his impulsive decision. He barely had time to process his own feelings. Clara had agreed to allow Eduardo to spend time with Mateo and Sofia, but things were far from simple. The children, though curious about their father, were also confused and sometimes reluctant. On a sunny afternoon in Chapultepec Park, Eduardo watched Mateo and Sofia playing on the playground. Clara was sitting beside him on the bench, an uncomfortable silence hanging between them. "They're amazing," Eduardo finally said, breaking the silence. "You did an incredible job raising them alone." Clara smiled sadly. "It wasn't easy, but they're my life." Eduardo hesitated before asking the question that had been tormenting him for weeks. "Why did you really come to the wedding, Clara?" "The truth." Clara took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the children playing. "I told myself it was for their sake so they could meet their father. But the truth is," she turned to face him, "I never stopped loving you, Eduardo. Seeing you marry someone else, I couldn't bear it." The revelation hit Eduardo like lightning. Before he could respond, his phone rang. It was Javier. "Eduardo, you need to come to the office now. We have a serious problem." Alarmed by Javier's tone, Eduardo apologized and rushed to his office in the city center. Upon arrival, he found Javier, pale and nervous. "What's going on?" Eduardo demanded. Javier hesitated before answering. "It's Valentina. She's threatening to expose some company irregularities if you don't resume the engagement." Eduardo felt his blood run cold. "What irregularities?" "Those government contracts we won last year. It seems there were some manipulations behind the scenes." Eduardo staggered, leaning on his desk. He had always known that his meteoric rise in the business world had a dark side, but he never imagined Valentina would use it against him. "Does she have proof?" Eduardo asked, fearing the answer. Javier nodded gravely. "Apparently she's been collecting information for months. As a precaution," she said. Eduardo's mind was spinning. Everything he had worked for was at risk. His reputation, his company, his future, and now the chance to be a father to his children. At that moment, his phone vibrated with a message from Clara. "The kids are asking if you're coming for dinner with us tonight." Eduardo looked at the message, then at Javier, the weight of his decision bearing down on him. On one side, the life he had built, his corporate empire and financial security. On the other, the chance for a family, true love, redemption. "What are we going to do?" Javier asked anxiously. Eduardo closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. When he opened them again, there was a fierce determination in his gaze. "Call our lawyers," he said firmly, "and schedule a press conference for tomorrow." Javier looked at him, shocked. "You're going to give in to her blackmail?" Eduardo shook his head. "No, I'm going to tell the truth, all of it. But that could destroy everything we've built. Maybe, Eduardo admitted, but it might also be our only chance to save something that really matters. He picked up his phone and replied to Clara's message. I'll be there for dinner, we have a lot to talk about. As Javier left to make the preparations, Eduardo was left alone in his office, looking out over the city he loved so much. He knew the next 24 hours would change his life forever. But for the first time in years, despite the fear and uncertainty, he felt he was finally doing the right thing. The next morning dawned with a palpable tension in the air. Eduardo had barely slept, spending the night reflecting on his choices and preparing for what was to come. Dinner with Clara and the children the night before had been bittersweet, full of joyful moments with Mateo and Sofia, but also laden with the weight of what he was about to do. At 9 a.m. sharp, Eduardo entered his company's conference room, where dozens of journalists were already anxiously waiting. Cameras clicked and flashes fired as he positioned himself behind the podium. Javier was at his side, his face a mask of concern. "Good morning, everyone," Eduardo began, his voice steady despite his internal nervousness. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice. I'm here today to make an important statement about my personal and professional life." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd. At the back of the room, he saw Clara quietly enter, her eyes meeting his in a moment of mutual understanding. "In recent years, I've built a company that has become a leader in technological innovation in Mexico. I'm proud of what we've achieved, but..." He took a deep breath. "That success came at a price. Today, I want to confess that in our pursuit of growth, we crossed some ethical lines that should never have been crossed." A murmur ran through the room. Javier closed his eyes, fearing the worst. "Specifically," Eduardo continued, "there were irregularities in how we obtained certain government contracts. I take full responsibility for these actions, and am fully cooperating with the authorities to correct these mistakes." Journalists began shouting questions, but Eduardo raised his hand to silence them. "There's more. I recently discovered that I'm the father of 2 wonderful 5-year-old twins. Children who, due to my ignorance and obsessive focus on professional success, I didn't know until a few weeks ago." The camera flashes intensified. At the back of the room, Clara covered her mouth with her hands, tears in her eyes. "I realized that in my pursuit of power and wealth, I lost sight of what really matters: family, integrity, love. I'm here today not just to confess my mistakes, but to begin the process of correcting them." At that moment, the doors of the conference room burst open. Valentina entered, her face a mixture of fury and shock. "Eduardo!" she shouted. "What do you think you're doing?" The room exploded into chaos, with journalists shouting questions and cameras spinning to capture the unexpected drama. Eduardo, surprisingly calm, turned to Valentina. "I'm doing the right thing for the first time in a long time." Valentina advanced towards the podium, but was intercepted by security guards. "You're throwing everything away!" she shouted. "Everything we built!" "No," Eduardo replied, his voice echoing through the microphone. "I'm rebuilding, on a stronger foundation." He turned back to the journalists. "As CEO, I'm temporarily stepping down to fully cooperate with any investigation. Our CFO, Javier Morales, will take over in the interim." Javier, caught off guard, stepped forward, nodding hesitantly. "As for my personal future," Eduardo continued, his eyes meeting Clara's again, "I am committed to being the father my children deserve and the man I should have always been." As Eduardo left the podium, the room exploded into a frenzy of questions and flashes. He walked directly to Clara, ignoring the journalists' shouts and Valentina's protests. "Are you okay?" he asked Clara softly. She nodded, tears in her eyes. "That was amazing and scary. What happens now?" Eduardo took her hand. "Now, we face whatever comes. Together, if you want." As they left the conference room side by side, Eduardo knew the path ahead would be difficult. There would be investigations, possible charges, and certainly a struggle to save his company. But for the first time in years, he felt truly free. Outside, a crowd of reporters awaited them. But before facing them, Eduardo turned to Clara. I'm Ready to be the man you and the children deserve, he said. If you still want me, Clara smiled through her tears. I always did. I was just waiting for you to be ready. Hand in hand, they faced the storm of flashes and questions, ready to start a new chapter together. In the weeks following the press conference, Eduardo's life transformed into a whirlwind. Investigations into his company's business practices were in full swing, and he spent hours in meetings with lawyers and investigators. At the same time, he tried to balance his new role as a father and his rekindled relationship with Clara. One afternoon, as Eduardo was playing with Mateo and Sofia in Clara's backyard, his phone rang. It was Javier. Eduardo, we have a problem. Javier's voice sounded tense. Valentina is making moves. She's trying to call a board meeting to permanently remove you from the company. Eduardo felt a knot in his stomach. Does she have enough support for that? Not yet, but she's close. And there's more. It seems she's in contact with our competitors. She might be planning a hostile takeover. As Eduardo absorbed the news, Clara approached, concern evident on her face. Is everything okay? He forced a smile. Just some work problems, nothing to worry about. But Clara knew him too well. Eduardo, remember what we promised? No more secrets. He sighed, agreeing. After hanging up with Javier, Eduardo explained the situation to Clara. What are you going to do? She asked, holding his hand. I don't know, Eduardo admitted. I fought so hard for this company, but now, looking at Mateo and Sofia, I wonder if it's worth it. At that moment, Sofia approached, holding a drawing. Daddy, look what I made. The drawing showed 4 sticks. Figures, her, Mateo, Clara, and Eduardo, all holding hands. Above, in colorful letters, was written, My family. Eduardo felt tears in his eyes. It's beautiful, mi amor, he said, hugging his daughter. Meanwhile, across town, Valentina was in her office, planning her next move. She was looking at a photo of her with Eduardo taken months ago. Miss Ortega, her assistant, interrupted her thoughts. Mr. Zhang from Tech Fusion is on the line. He wants to discuss the acquisition proposal. Valentina smiled coldly. Great, put him through. As she prepared for the call, a knock on the door surprised her. It was her younger sister, Lucia. Val, we need to talk, Lucia said, entering the office. What are you doing? This revenge against Eduardo. This isn't you. Valentina turned, irritated. You don't understand, Lucia. He humiliated me. Threw away years of planning, all because of an ex-girlfriend and 2 bastards. Lucia recoiled, shocked by the bitterness in her sister's voice. Val, are you listening to yourself? These are innocent children. And Eduardo is trying to do the right thing. The right thing? Valentina laughed bitterly. He's destroying everything we built. No, Val, you are. With that, Lucia left the office, leaving Valentina alone with her thoughts. Back at Clara's house, Eduardo received another call, this time from an unknown number. It was Lucia. Eduardo, it's me, Lucia, Valentina's sister, she said hurriedly. Look, I don't have much time, but you need to know. Valentina is planning to sell the company to Tech Fusion. She's blinded by revenge. Eduardo was stunned. Tech Fusion was known for dismantling companies and selling off their assets. If they took control, hundreds of jobs would be at risk. Thank you for letting me know, Lucia, Eduardo said. But why? There was a pause on the other end of the line. Because what you're doing, me trying to be a good father, taking responsibility for your mistakes, it's admirable. And because Valentina needs to be stopped before she destroys herself. After hanging up, Eduardo found himself facing a new dilemma. He had to save the company not for himself but for the employees who depended on it. But how could he do that without compromising the time and dedication he had promised to his new family? Clara, sensing his distress, approached. What is it now? Eduardo looked at her, conflict evident in his eyes. I need to go back to the company to save it, but I don't want to leave you all. Clara smiled softly. Who said you have to leave? Maybe it's time for all of us to face this together. Clara's words sparked an idea in Eduardo. Perhaps there was a way to unite his 2 worlds, to be the father and the leader everyone needed him to be. With a new purpose, Eduardo stood up. It was time to devise a plan, one that would save his company and solidify his new family. The battle was just beginning. Eduardo's office was quiet, except for the soft hum of the air conditioner and the occasional rustle of papers being flipped. It was almost midnight, and he was hunched over financial documents and corporate reports, trying to find a way out of the labyrinth he found himself in. Clara entered quietly, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "I thought you might need this," she said, placing a cup beside him. Eduardo looked up, a tired smile on his face. "Thank you. You didn't have to stay up." "We're a team now, remember?" Clara replied, sitting down next to him. "Besides, the kids are asleep. It's the perfect time for us to plan." Eduardo nodded, grateful for her presence. "Valentina is moving the pieces quickly. If we don't act soon, we'll lose the company to Tech Fusion." Clara examined some of the documents. What if you proposed a restructuring? Something that shows the board and shareholders that you're committed to ethics and transparency, but also to sustainable growth. Eduardo's eyes lit up. That could work, but we'd need support from someone on the inside. At that moment, Eduardo's phone rang. It was Javier. "Eduardo, I have news." Javier's voice sounded tense. "Valentina has called an emergency board meeting for tomorrow. She's going to try to force a vote for your removal and approve the sale to Tech Fusion." Eduardo exchanged a worried look with Clara. "Thank you, Javier. I'll be there." After hanging up, Eduardo stood up, walking to the window. The city glittered below, reminding him of everything at stake. "Are you going to face her?" Clara asked softly. Eduardo turned, determination in his eyes. "I am, but not alone. Clara, I know it's asking a lot, but would you come with me? We'd face this together?" Clara hesitated for a moment. "And the children?" "We can ask my mother to stay with them. It's time for her to meet her grandchildren anyway," Eduardo suggested. Clara smiled, remembering how Eduardo's mother had always treated her well in the past. "All right, I'm with you." The next morning, the company building was buzzing with activity. Board members, executives, and even some reporters crowded the corridors, all speculating about what would happen in the meeting. Eduardo and Clara arrived together, hand in hand, causing a stir among those present. Valentina, who was talking to some board members, froze when she saw them. "What is she doing here?" Valentina hissed as Eduardo approached. "Clara is my partner in every sense now," Eduardo replied calmly, "and she has some ideas that the board should hear." Before Valentina could retort, the doors to the meeting room opened. It was time for the confrontation. The meeting started tense, with Valentina presenting her proposal to sell to Tech Fusion, arguing it was the best option for shareholders, in light of recent scandals. When it was Eduardo's turn to speak, he stood up, Clara by his side. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he began, "I know I've made mistakes that almost cost not only my reputation, but the future of this company that we've all built together." He paused, looking at each face in the room. "But today, I'm not here to ask for forgiveness. I'm here to offer a new path, a path of transparency, ethics, and sustainable growth." With Clara's help, Eduardo presented a detailed restructuring plan. It included the creation of an independent ethics committee, investments in green technologies, and a profit-sharing program for employees. As the presentation progressed, it was visible that some board members were reconsidering their positions. Valentina, realizing she was losing ground, decided to play her last card. "This is ridiculous," she exclaimed, standing up. "Are you really going to trust him again? And this woman who appeared out of nowhere with 2 children?" The silence that followed was deafening. Eduardo felt anger bubbling inside him, but before he could respond, Clara stepped forward. "My name is Clara Mendoza," she said, her voice firm. "I'm an architect, a mother, and yes, Eduardo's ex-girlfriend. But more importantly, I'm someone who believes in second chances and in people's ability to change for the better." Her eyes scanned the room, meeting each gaze. "The plan we presented is not just about saving a company. It's about redefining what this company stands for. Integrity, family, responsible innovation. These are values we can all support, don't you think?" The silence that followed was broken by a solitary applause, It was Javier. Soon others joined in, and Eduardo knew the tide had turned. The vote that followed was close, but in the end, Eduardo and Clara's plan was approved, and the proposal to sell to Tech Fusion was rejected. As the board members left the room, Eduardo pulled Clara into a tight hug. "We did it," he whispered. "Yes," she replied, smiling. "Now comes the hard part." "Which is?" Eduardo asked, confused. Clara laughed softly. "Explaining to Mateo and Sofia why Mommy and Daddy are going to work together now." Eduardo smiled, realizing that for the first time in years he was truly happy. The path ahead would be challenging, but with Clara and the children by his side, he was ready to face any obstacle. The weeks following the board meeting were a whirlwind of activity. Eduardo and Clara worked tirelessly to implement the promised changes in the company, while trying to balance their newly formed family life. One afternoon, as Eduardo was in his office reviewing some documents, Javier rushed in, wearing a concerned expression. "Eduardo, we have a problem," Javier said, closing the door behind him. "I just received information that the prosecutor's office is about to open a formal investigation into the government contracts." Eduardo felt his blood run cold. "But we were already cooperating with the authorities. What changed?" Javier hesitated before answering. "It seems someone provided new evidence. Evidence that, well, that directly implicates you in some of the most questionable decisions." "But that's impossible," Eduardo exclaimed, rising from his chair. "I took responsibility for what we did, but I never—" He stopped, a sudden realization hitting him. "Valentina," he murmured. Javier nodded grimly. "That's what we're suspecting. She had access to practically everything." At that moment, Clara entered the office, interrupting the conversation. She immediately noticed the tension in the air. "What's going on?" Eduardo hesitated, not wanting to worry her, but remembering the promise of honesty they had made. He briefly explained the situation. Clara listened attentively, her face a mixture of concern and determination. "What can we do?" she asked. "I don't know," Eduardo admitted. "If this evidence is convincing, even if fabricated, we could be facing criminal charges." Clara was silent for a moment, thoughtful. What if we could prove that the evidence was fabricated?" Eduardo and Javier looked at her, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Eduardo asked. "Well, when I worked on architecture projects, we sometimes had to deal with fraudulent documents. We learned some techniques to identify forgeries," Clara explained. "If we could get access to this new evidence," Javier interrupted, excited. "I have a contact at the prosecutor's office. Maybe we can get a copy." Eduardo hesitated. "Wouldn't that be illegal?" Clara put her hand on his shoulder. "It's risky, yes, but we're talking about your freedom, Eduardo. The children's future." After a moment of reflection, Eduardo nodded. "Okay, let's try." In the days that followed, they worked discreetly. Javier managed to obtain copies of the evidence through his contact, and Clara spent nights meticulously analyzing them. Meanwhile, the pressure was mounting. News of the impending investigation leaked to the press, and soon the company was surrounded by reporters. The stock price plummeted, and some investors began to pressure for changes in leadership. One night, as Eduardo was putting Mateo and Sofia to bed, Sofia innocently asked, "Daddy, why are there so many people with cameras outside?" Eduardo felt a lump in his throat. They're just curious about Daddy's work, sweetheart." Mateo, always perceptive, frowned. "They look angry." Eduardo hugged them both. "Don't worry. Daddy and Mommy will sort everything out. I promise." After closing the children's bedroom door, Eduardo found Clara in the living room, surrounded by papers and her laptop. "Any progress?" he asked hopefully. Clara looked at him, a glimmer of triumph in her eyes. "I think so. Look at this." She showed him some inconsistencies in the documents, patterns indicating digital manipulation. "This is amazing, Clara," Eduardo exclaimed. "This might be enough to—" Their celebration was interrupted by Eduardo's phone ringing. It was an unknown number. "Hello?" Eduardo answered cautiously. "Mr. Ramírez," a deep voice responded. "This is the Attorney General. We need to talk tomorrow 9 a.m. at my office. Eduardo felt his heart race. I understand, I'll be there. After hanging up, he turned to Clara, his face pale. It was the Attorney General. He wants to see me tomorrow. Clara took his hand, squeezing it firmly. We'll face this together. We have the truth on our side now. As they embraced, seeking comfort in each other outside the house, a shadowy figure was observing through binoculars. It was one of the investigators hired by Valentina. He picked up his phone, dialing quickly. Miss Ortega, they've discovered something. I think it's time we move to Plan B. The night advanced, and with it the feeling that the following day would bring a decisive confrontation. Eduardo and Clara, embracing on the couch, knew that the future of their family and the company hung by a thread. But together, they were determined to fight to the end. Morning arrived with a palpable tension in the air. Eduardo was preparing for his meeting with the Attorney General, adjusting his tie in front of the mirror. Clara entered the room carrying a folder. Here's all the evidence we've gathered, she said, handing the folder to Eduardo. Remember, you're not alone in this. Eduardo hugged her tightly. I don't know what I'd do without you, Clara. At that moment, Matteo and Sofia came running into the room. Daddy, are you going to work? Sofia asked, her big eyes full of concern. Eduardo knelt down to be at eye level with his children. Yes, sweetheart. Daddy has a very important meeting. Today. Matteo, always observant, noticed the tension in his father's face. Is everything going to be okay, Daddy? Eduardo swallowed hard, fighting against his emotions. Of course it will, champ. Daddy promises. After one last family hug, Eduardo left for the Attorney General's office, the weight of the world on his shoulders. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Valentina was in her own office, pacing nervously. Her phone rang. Yes? She answered abruptly. Miss Ortega, this is Ramírez, the investigator. I have worrying news. It seems Ramírez and his partner have discovered something about the evidence. Valentina felt a chill down her spine. What exactly did they discover? I'm not sure, but they seemed confident. They're taking something to the meeting with the Attorney General today. Valentina hung up the phone, her mind racing. She knew she needed to act fast. Grabbing her purse, she hurried out of the office. At the Attorney General's office, Eduardo waited anxiously. The Attorney General, a middle-aged man with penetrating eyes, entered the room. Mr. Ramírez, he began, his voice grave, we're here to discuss some inconsistencies in your company's contracts with the government. Eduardo took a deep breath. Mr. Attorney General, before we begin, I'd like to present some information that I believe is crucial to this investigation. He opened the folder Clara had prepared, explaining in detail the evidence of manipulation they had discovered. The Attorney General listened attentively, his face impassive. This is interesting, Mr. Ramírez, the Attorney General finally said, but it still doesn't fully explain the irregularities we found. At that moment, there was a knock on the door. The Attorney General's secretary entered, looking nervous. Sorry for the interruption, sir, but there's someone here insisting on speaking with you. Says it's about the Ramírez case. The Attorney General frowned. Who is it? A Mrs. Lucia Ortega. Eduardo was surprised. Lucia, Valentina's sister, the Attorney General hesitated for a moment before nodding. Let her in. Lucia entered the room looking agitated. I'm sorry for the intrusion, but this couldn't wait. She turned to Eduardo. I know what my sister did, and I have proof. Eduardo and the Attorney General exchanged surprised looks. Lucia continued, Valentina, she fabricated evidence against you, Eduardo. I found out and, well, I couldn't stay silent. She handed a flash drive to the Attorney General. Here are emails, text messages, and recordings that prove the manipulation. The Attorney General connected the flash drive to his computer, quickly examining the contents. His face became increasingly serious as he read. This is quite incriminating, he murmured. Eduardo was stunned. Lucia, why? Lucia sighed. Because what Valentina is doing is wrong, and because, well, I remember how you were when you were with Clara. Happy, genuine. I think you deserve a second chance. At that moment, the Attorney General's phone rang. After a brief conversation, He turned to Eduardo and Lucia, his face grave. "Ladies and gentlemen, I've just received some information. Valentina Ortega has been detained trying to leave the country with a significant amount of undeclared money." Eduardo sat down, suddenly feeling exhausted. Everything was happening so fast. The Attorney General continued, "Mr. Ramírez, in light of this new evidence, the investigation against you will be reevaluated. I can't promise anything, but it seems your situation has just significantly improved." Eduardo nodded, grateful. "Thank you, sir, and thank you, Lucia. I don't know how to thank you." Lucia smiled sadly. "Just take good care of your family, Eduardo, and maybe you can help Valentina when all this is over. She needs help, not punishment." As he left the Attorney General's office, Eduardo felt as if an enormous weight had been lifted from his shoulders. He picked up his phone, dialing Clara's number with trembling fingers. "Clara, it's over. We're okay." On the other end of the line, he heard Clara sob with relief. "Thank God, Eduardo. Come home, we have a lot to celebrate." As he walked out of the building, Eduardo felt for the first time in months that the future was bright. He had his family, his integrity, and a chance to start over. And this time, he would do everything right. The days that followed were an emotional roller coaster for Eduardo and his family. The news of Valentina's detention and Eduardo's exoneration exploded in the media, creating a frenzy of speculation and commentary. Eduardo and Clara decided to isolate themselves temporarily, focusing on their family and the restructuring of the company. They rented an isolated beach house, taking Matteo and Sofia away from the chaos of the city. On a sunny afternoon, while the children played in the sand, Eduardo and Clara walked hand in hand on the beach. "Do you think we did the right thing?" Clara asked, breaking the comfortable silence between them. Eduardo stopped, turning to face her. "What do you mean?" Clara sighed. "With Valentina, exposing everything. Sometimes I wonder if we were too harsh." Eduardo reflected for a moment. "I understand what you're saying, but remember, it wasn't us who exposed her. It was Lucia who made that decision." "Yes, but..." Clara hesitated. "Maybe we could have found another way, one that didn't completely destroy her." Eduardo hugged Clara, feeling the weight of her words. "You're right. Maybe it's time we reached out to her. Offer help, not judgment." At that moment, Eduardo's phone rang. It was Javier. "Eduardo, sorry to interrupt your vacation, but we have a situation." Javier's voice sounded tense. "The press is pushing for an official statement from you, and, well, some of the major investors are threatening to withdraw their support if we don't get back to normal quickly." Eduardo closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility return. "I understand, Javier. I'll think of something and call you back." After hanging up, he turned to Clara, who was looking at him with concern. "The problems found us, didn't they?" she asked softly. Eduardo nodded. "It seems so. We need to go back and face all this head-on." Clara took his hand, squeezing it reassuringly. "We're in this together, remember?" Back in the city, Eduardo and Clara dove headfirst into work. They organized a press conference to address all pending issues and present the new direction of the company. On the day of the conference, the company's auditorium was packed with journalists, investors, and employees. Eduardo, with Clara by his side, took the stage. "Good afternoon, everyone," Eduardo began, his voice firm. "In the past few weeks, our company, my family, and I have gone through immense turmoil. Mistakes were made, truths were revealed, and difficult lessons were learned." He paused, looking at Clara, who nodded encouragingly. "Today, I'm not just here to apologize or to promise changes. I'm here to show that these changes are already underway." Eduardo then detailed the company's new ethics and compliance plan, investments in sustainable technologies, and the employee benefits program. With each announcement, the buzz in the room increased. "But there's something else I want to address," Eduardo continued, his voice softening. "Throughout this process, I learned the importance of forgiveness and redemption. That's why today I'm announcing that our company will be creating a rehabilitation program for executives who have made ethical mistakes." A murmur of surprise ran through the audience, and the first name in this program, Eduardo took a deep breath, will be Valentina Ortega. The auditorium erupted in raised voices. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed frantically. "Clara, surprised by the announcement, looked at Eduardo with a mixture of pride and concern. Meanwhile, in a prison cell, Valentina was watching the press conference on a small TV. Silent tears ran down her face as she listened to Eduardo's words. Back in the auditorium, Eduardo raised his hands, asking for silence. "I know this decision may be controversial, but I believe everyone deserves a second chance. I received mine, and it's my duty to extend this opportunity to others." He turned to Clara, taking her hand. "I learned that true success isn't in the contracts we close or the money we make. It's in the lives we touch, the families we build, and the communities we strengthen." Eduardo's words resonated through the auditorium, touching hearts and minds. Gradually, the tumult turned into applause. As they left the stage, Eduardo and Clara knew that the road ahead would still be challenging. There would be critics, skeptics, and obstacles, but for the first time in a long time, they felt they were truly on the right path. 6 months passed since the press conference that changed everything. Eduardo's company, renamed New Horizon, was at the center of attention in the corporate world. The rehabilitation program for executives, bold and controversial, was about to graduate its first class. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and the company's large auditorium was packed. Employees, press, and even critics of the program had gathered to witness the graduation ceremony. Eduardo nervously adjusted his tie backstage. Clara approached, holding his hand. "Is everything okay?" she asked softly. Eduardo nodded, a tense smile on his face. "Just a bit nervous. There's so much at stake today." Clara smiled reassuringly. "Remember why we're doing this. It's not about business. It's about second chances." At that moment, Javier appeared, looking agitated. "Eduardo, we have a problem. Valentina. She hasn't shown up." Eduardo felt a knot in his stomach. Valentina was the centerpiece of the program. Her absence could be disastrous. "I'll call her," Clara said quickly, grabbing her phone. While Clara tried to make contact, Eduardo was called to the stage. He took a deep breath and walked to the center, facing the anxious crowd. "Good morning, everyone," he began, his voice firm despite his nervousness. "Today is a day of celebration, of new beginnings." As Eduardo spoke, Clara discreetly entered the stage, whispering something in his ear. His face turned serious for a moment, but he continued his speech without hesitation. "The New Horizon program is not just about corporate rehabilitation," Eduardo continued. "It's about recognizing our humanity, our capacity to make mistakes, and more importantly, our capacity to grow and change." At that moment, the doors of the auditorium opened. Valentina entered, looking nervous but determined. A murmur ran through the audience. Eduardo paused, a genuine smile spreading across his face. "And speaking of change, I'd like to call to the stage someone who embodies exactly what I'm talking about. Valentina Ortega, please join me." Valentina walked slowly to the stage, everyone's eyes fixed on her. When she reached Eduardo's side, she took the microphone, her hands trembling slightly. "Good afternoon," she began, her voice hoarse with emotion. I almost didn't come today. The fear, the shame, they almost overcame me." She paused, taking a deep breath. "But then I remembered something I learned in this program. Courage is not the absence of fear, it's acting despite it." Valentina then turned to Eduardo. "Eduardo, Clara, I owe you more than words can express. You had every reason to hate me, to destroy me. But instead, you extended your hand to me." Tears began to form in her eyes. "I made terrible mistakes. I was consumed by ambition and resentment. But thanks to this program, thanks to your compassion, I found a new purpose." She turned to the audience. "From today on, I will dedicate my life and my resources to helping other people who have lost their way. Because if I could change, anyone can." The auditorium erupted in applause. Eduardo, moved, hugged Valentina, a gesture that was captured by dozens of cameras and would become the symbol image of the day. Clara joined them on stage, bringing Matteo and Sofia. The children, now older and understanding the situation better, hugged Valentina too. "Aunt Val!" Sofia exclaimed, making everyone laugh and breaking the tension. Eduardo took the microphone again. "This is true success," he said, looking at his family and Valentina. "It's not about profits or headlines. It's about the ability to forgive, to grow, to build bridges where there were once walls." He paused, looking at each face in the audience. "Today we're not just graduating a class. We're inaugurating a new era in business, an era of ethics, compassion, and responsibility." Eduardo's words were met with a standing ovation. Journalists rushed to ask questions, investors applauded enthusiastically, and employees wiped away tears of emotion. As the auditorium vibrated, Eduardo hugged Clara and the children, with Valentina by their side. At that moment, he knew they had succeeded, not just in saving the company or rehabilitating Valentina, but in creating something truly meaningful. The road ahead would still be challenging, but now they had something powerful on their side. Hope. Hope for a future where past mistakes could become springboards for a better tomorrow. The sun was setting over Mexico City, painting the sky with shades of orange and pink. On the rooftop of the New Horizon building, Eduardo stood by the railing, observing the city he loved so much. The last few months had been an incredible journey, full of challenges, but also unexpected triumphs. Clara approached, wrapping her arms around his waist. "What are you thinking about?" she asked softly. Eduardo smiled, turning to face her. "About how life can change so drastically in such a short time. A year ago, I was about to marry the wrong person, hiding secrets and living a life that wasn't truly mine." Clara nodded, understanding. "And now?" "Now," Eduardo said, pulling her closer, "I have everything I ever wanted, even without knowing I wanted it. A family, a purpose, a chance to make a real difference." The sound of children's laughter interrupted the moment. Matteo and Sofia came, running, followed by a smiling Valentina. "Daddy, Mommy," Matteo exclaimed, "Aunt Val taught us a new game." Eduardo crouched down, hugging his children. "That's great, champ. Are you having fun with Aunt Val?" Sofia nodded enthusiastically. "She's the best. Can we play more with her tomorrow?" Valentina, who had approached, exchanged a meaningful look with Eduardo and Clara. "If your parents allow it, of course you can." Clara smiled warmly. "Of course, you can. In fact, why don't we all have dinner together tomorrow?" The children cheered, running back inside to continue playing. Valentina stayed behind, an expression of gratitude on her face. "I can never thank you enough for what you've done for me," she said softly. Eduardo put a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to thank us, Val. We all deserve a second chance. What's important is what we do with it." Valentina nodded, tears in her eyes. "I promise I won't waste this opportunity. The work we're doing with the rehabilitation program, it's changing lives." Clara smiled. "And it's not just the lives of the program participants. Have you seen the impact this is having on the industry as a whole? Other companies are starting to implement similar programs." Eduardo nodded, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "It's true, we're creating a wave of change, and it's bigger than any of us." They stood in silence for a moment, contemplating the city as it lit up with the falling night. "You know," Eduardo finally said, "I think I've learned the most important lesson of my life this past year." "And what would that be?" Clara asked, curious. Eduardo smiled, looking at Clara, at Valentina, and then inside where he could hear his children's laughter. "That true success isn't measured by money or power. It's measured by the positive impact we have on others' lives. By the family we build, the relationships we nurture, the second chances we offer and receive." Valentina nodded, moved. "And by the courage to admit our mistakes and work to correct them." Clara squeezed Eduardo's hand. "And by love. We can't forget about love." Eduardo chuckled softly. "Yes, definitely by love." As they went inside to join the children, Eduardo couldn't help but reflect on how his life had changed. From a businessman, focused solely on financial success, he had become a man dedicated to family, ethical business practices, and making a difference in the world. The journey hadn't been easy. There were moments of doubt, fear, of almost giving up. But each challenge, each obstacle overcome, had made him stronger, wiser. And now, looking at his family, Clara, Matteo, Sofia, and even Valentina, Eduardo knew he had found something far more valuable than any material wealth. He had found his true purpose. As night fell over Mexico City, on the rooftop of the Novo Horizonte building, a family celebrated not just the end of a journey, but the beginning of many others. Journeys of love, redemption, and second chances. And you, dear viewer, what will you do with your second chance? How will you use your power to positively impact others' lives? Remember, it's never too late to change, to forgive, to start anew, because in the end, we are all protagonists of our own redemption stories. And the next chapter? Well, the next chapter begins now, and so ends this incredible journey of Eduardo, Clara, and their families, a story that shows us that love, forgiveness, and second chances can transform lives and create a better future for all. But the journey doesn't end here. Just as Eduardo discovered his true purpose, you too can make a difference. Start right now. If this story touched your heart, don't hesitate to leave a like. Each like is like a hug for our team and motivates us to keep bringing inspiring stories. Like this one. In the comments, tell us which moment moved you the most. Was it when Eduardo discovered he was a father? Or perhaps when he decided to give Valentina a second chance? Your opinion is valuable and can inspire others. And don't stop here. In the corner of the screen, you'll find more touching stories that will make you laugh, cry, and above all, believe in the power of love and redemption. Click on them and continue this amazing journey with us. Finally, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon. This way, you'll be the first to know when a new story arrives, ready to touch your heart and brighten your day. Remember, every story we share is an opportunity to change a life. Perhaps the next life to be transformed will be yours. Until next time, and don't forget, love always wins.